Hello everyone, welcome to Bahçes. This is our second episode of the webinar series, and I'm Lambros Asvestas, one of the general coordinators of the team. So we are a youth-led initiative and we want to explore the histories of Cyprus, and we are inviting everyone to do it together. All of our work is based on a voluntary basis. So if you like what we do, feel free to donate in our website. And if you want to contribute in another way and join our team, let us know. There is always there is room for everyone from all communities. We are open to all. So yeah, the webinar today will take up to 35 minutes, and there will be another 30 minutes for Q&A afterwards. And today I will be moderating with Maria Constantinidou, another general coordinator of the team. Hello, Maria.
Thank you, Lambro. Hello, everyone. We are glad to have you with us today, guys. Just bear in mind that this webinar is going to be recorded and then uploaded on our YouTube channel and website. So just after the presentation, there will be time for a Q&A, but feel free to write any questions during the webinar in the chat or in the Facebook Live event. Today, we're very excited to have with us Dr. Loizos Kapsalis for his webinar on gender, class, and nation, reshaping identity in British colonial Cyprus. So a little bit about Loizos Kapsalis. He's a social and cultural historian, specializing in the 19th and early 20th century Cyprus. He's currently a visiting research associate at King's College London and a scientific collaborator at the European University of Cyprus. So I hope you enjoy this webinar, and we give the floor to Loizos for his talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks, Lambros. Hi, everyone. Hi from a warm and summery Nicosia. Like Maria said, my name is Loizos, and I'm also one of the editors of the Bahçes group. And it's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to share with you a little bit of my research today. And I'm actually really excited to get to the part where we discuss, which is actually what we want to do here at Bahçes. So I'm going to try and keep this monologue phase of the webinar to around 30 minutes, and then we'll go straight into the discussion. And like Lambros and Maria said, today I want to invite you to think with me about how ideas about gender, class, the nation come together to shape or reshape Cypriot's sense of self, and to create or maintain new social differences in the early period of British rule, which is the period leading up to the to the First World War. Of course, this is a question that we will keep coming back to with Bahçes. This is one of our aims as editors, is to keep coming back to this this question, to approach it from different angles. So today, what I want to do is to explore this topic through an examination or exploration of a series of projects through which a section of the Greek Cypriot elite, what we might think of as the more affluent, the more educated, urbanized social strata of the Greek Cypriot community, tried to transform and, as they saw it, improve Cypriot society during this early period of colonial rule. And I use the term projects as an umbrella term. So it is a catch-all phrase to sort of encompass the wide range of initiatives that may at first sight seem like they have divergent and contradictory aims. And in my work, I tend to think about things like the founding of schools and the founding of libraries, the opening of sports associations and religious societies and working men's clubs, and the publishing of newspapers and periodicals, and the introduction of new legislation, and some of the laws that come up during this period that we are studying concern the carrying of guns or knives, or regulating working on Sunday, things like dancing at weddings or selling sex. All of these things are what I would consider these projects to transform society. And Cypriot historians, they tend to overlook projects like this. After all, a lot of these tend to stay on paper. They never get off the ground. Others are really short-lived and quite unsuccessful in what they're trying to do. Other historians tend to look at them independently. So we have a lot of histories of education, let's say, in Cyprus, or we have histories of sports. But I think it makes sense to, and we should, examine them together as a group, because at the end of the day, they are all underlain by this fundamental principle, which is that in their founders and their members all believe that in order to transform society, in order to improve society, we have to transform individuals, change their character. And so effectively what these projects are is an intervention into the everyday lives, the values and the character of people. And while these projects generally explode, they take off during the period of British rule, I think we can trace their origins back to the last few years of Ottoman rule on the island. And so I'm going to just take a step back and think about what was going on in Cyprus during the sort of last 15 years of Ottoman rule on the island. And 1856 is, I think, a really good starting point for what I'm trying to do. It's the year when the Ottoman Sultan Abdülmecid I inaugurates a new phase of the Tanzimat. And the Tanzimat is a series of sort of top-down, state-directed reforms, which are whose aim is to sort of overhaul the administrative structures of the empire. And as part of these reforms, Abdülmecid promises that he is going to grant a greater degree of self-governance to the non-Muslim populations of the empire. By the 60s, the millets, the non-Muslim populations, start to develop their own formalized administrative structures. And at the same time, the Sultan also promises that with these reforms that he's about to bring, comes a new era for the Ottoman Empire. And he says it's a new era of possibility and welfare and progress. Of course, we know that Abdülmecid's ambitious plans largely failed. However, we also know that they created a space for the flourishing of smaller scale local reform projects in the Eastern Mediterranean. So in cities like Beirut, Damascus and Cairo and Alexandria, local leaders who are emboldened by the new privileges they have acquired and sort of buoyed by this feeling or this climate of optimism that is created by the Tanzimat, embark on their own quite ambitious projects to transform their societies. And between the 1850s and the 1860s, around the Mediterranean, we see parallel changes: the founding of printing presses, the literary and scientific societies, urban regeneration, new architecture, new art, and so on. And the Cypriots are, of course, quite aware of these developments in the Eastern Mediterranean. There is a lot of research going on now, both by Cypriot historians and people abroad, to explain exactly how Cypriots are experiencing this period of reform and change in the late Ottoman Empire. We know for sure that Cypriots are living and working and studying in all kinds of communities in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Syria and Palestine, and Egypt, and so there is this exchange of ideas and information. And in 1859, and that's 3 years after the proclamation of this phase of the Tanzimat, Archbishop Makarios I announces his own plans to develop a centralized education system for the population of Cyprus. And he explicitly states that this is inspired by everything he sees around in the neighboring countries. He says he is inspired by the great progress made in regions outside our homeland, in their social life, as well as the welfare they are able to enjoy. And this project to reform Cypriot education is enthusiastically taken up by both the religious and the lay leaders of the Orthodox community on the island. And between 1860, when sort of the intention is declared, to 1879, so the year after the British arrive on the island, the number of schools quadruples, from going up from 20 schools to 83. Now, Makarios's vision for the transformation or the improvement of Cypriot society was founded on the creation of a new generation of Cypriots who would be hardworking and educated and inspired by a love for the community and ready to sacrifice their personal gain for the good of the community. And this molding of the character of the youth is explicitly stated by Makarios. He says the aims of his schools is to genuinely instruct the young in the ways of virtue, introducing them into society as capable, offering them a life that is prosperous, moral, and comfortable. And the establishment of this school network allows the development in the 1860s and 1870s of quite a small but influential group of intellectuals on the island. And a prominent journalist in the 1830s called the men and women who comprised this group the young Cypriots. And I think it's quite a telling name for this group, and we can talk about it more later. The group is comprised primarily of school teachers who come back to the island with the aim of teaching. They are generally young. A lot of them are still in their late teens. They are educated abroad, not just in Athens, but also in Istanbul and Beirut. They tend to be the more affluent strata of society, and they generally maintain these family or personal links to the political and religious establishment, the sort of the political and religious elite of the island. But what sets them apart is this new worldview, which is grounded in a patriotism, desire to improve the patria, the homeland, and they are openly wanting to break from the social and cultural world of their fathers. And I think there is a lot to be said here about the term young as a rebellion from against the father. And the way they envision this break is through the reconnecting intellectually with the island's pre-Ottoman sort of classical Greek and European past. So what I'm going to say here is that by the closing years of Ottoman rule, we already have a small but coherent movement for social reform among the Greek Cypriots. And at the moment, it is quite small and limited in scope and quite top-down and primarily driven by optimism and self-confidence created by the sort of social, economic, and cultural transformations of the Tanzimat period. You can see how there is an idealized image of the young Cypriot or the modern Cypriot that emerges, sort of young in age, primarily male, urban, intellectual, patriotic, and starting to look outside the confines of the island, and increasingly not to the east, but to the west, and specifically to the Greek past and the Hellenic kind of nation beyond the sort of the borders of Cyprus. And the transition to British rule in 1878 is seen by the majority of the Greek Cypriots, all Cypriots, let's not limit it. It's seen as an opportunity to advance and continue this effort to transform and improve society. However, it very quickly becomes apparent that this would not be the case. And anyone who has read Georgalidis's account of this period between 1878 and sort of 1926 can just really feel the crushing disappointment that the local population starts to feel this disillusionment with the British Empire, that on which so much was expected of them and will not deliver. Of course, the British, once they arrive, they will extract a large portion of the island's yearly revenue to service an old loan made by the Ottoman government. And this, of course, leaves scarce funds for development projects on the island. And at the same time, the British government imposes a more exacting, let's say, methods for the collection of taxes, which imposes a disproportionate burden on the poorest, the rural population of the island, who in turn have to resort year after year to usurious moneylenders to make ends meet. And this is a precarious system that comes crashing down in the mid-1880s. So it all starts with a failure of crops. People cannot pay their debts to the moneylenders, and so we have a big wave of forcible sales of properties and livelihoods, leaving a big part of the population, especially in the northeast of the island, but gradually spreading to the towns of debt and extreme poverty. And the newspapers of this period reflect the dire condition on the island. There are increasing reports of surges in crime, begging in the streets, gambling, prostitution, disease. It's a sort of image of a society coming undone. And of course, we know that these accounts are based in truth. I mean, it's a time of crisis and people have to make difficult choices about how to make ends meet. But the reports, I think, also reveal the anxieties of the higher strata. I mean, there is, of course, a genuine philanthropic interest, a sort of anxiety about the fate and the future of these people who appear now in poverty. But there is also a kind of self-serving concern about social order and the position of the sort of the established members of society within it. And we have to remember that these are the early years of the sort of what we would now call the middle class coalescing, gradually coming up as a more coherent body within society. And they're starting to worry about, you know, what happens when all of the people who have been hit so hard by the crisis decide that it's time to claim more political privileges. And so what we can see in the press and well, primarily in the newspapers of the time and also memoirs, of course, is this new articulation of the Cypriot poor as a dangerous and disorderly force in society. We have representations of the lower strata as illiterate, superstitious, and lazy, responsible for this, for the fate in which they find themselves. And the dominant metaphor for poverty is disease. It's a disease that is spreading through this social body and you know, is in danger of sort of taking over all of society. A bit dramatic, but again. So in response to this panic, the members of the elite embark on this process to lift the poor out of their ignorance and vice. And there is no easy way to sort of give an idea of the magnitude of this response or of the diversity of the practices it encompassed. I guess perhaps at this point it is enough to say that it was, let's say, a systematic and far-reaching effort to intervene into the daily lives of the population and to try to transform its values and culture. And one of the earliest and most long-lived projects during this period is the project to popularize sport among the Greek Cypriots. The idea came originally from a number of young men who had studied at the university in Athens and had seen how the public education system in Greece incorporated gymnastics. And returning to the island, they started gymnastics associations. So the first one is the Gasipi in Nicosia, founded in 1890, and then the Gasio in Limassol, 1892, and Gasio quickly became sort of the most dominant club on the island. But by, let's say, 1895, when the first Pan-Cyprian athletic games are scheduled, all the major towns on the island have their sports clubs, and also some of the smaller towns maintain associations. And the primary focus of these associations is to bring young men, especially of the working strata, in direct contact, involvement in sport. So what they do is they will found gyms and provide the equipment and offer training in gymnastics and athletics in the afternoons. And then as we go into the 1900s, they will also organize excursions, which include hiking and camping and visiting ancient monuments and singing and so on. And from these activities, it is easy to sort of understand that the purpose is to offer young men alternative, more sanitized forms of recreation, to distance them from the sort of coffee shops and bars that can potentially lead them to a life of vice, as the sort of the higher ups imagine it to be. But at the same time, they are meant to forge links between these working men and the more affluent members of the associations. And it's important here that they focus on offering gymnastics, which is considered as the sort of social leveler, the leveler of social difference, as opposed to other forms of other sports that tend to be more popular among the higher strata, like in Cyprus, horse racing or tennis or rowing or cycling. The point I want to make here, however, is that the choice of gymnastics is significant because it is also seen as a way to shape someone's character as well as the body. And this is what that phrase that is still quite well known, nous υγιείς and soma υγιές, or nous υγιείς and soma γεγιμασμένο, is a healthy mind in a healthy or a trained body. And this phrase is constantly repeated in the press. And one of these more prominent promoters of sort of this movement to popularize sport, an editor of one of the newspapers explains that when we speak of gymnastics, we're not referring to the dangerous and pointless exercises of the acrobat, but rather to those which grant man health, strength, and beauty, which help him understand the meaning of order and discipline, and finally to those which give birth in his soul to military sentiment, and will turn him into a brave and willing and proud child of the fatherland. So what we're seeing here is the creation of an idealized Greek Cypriot masculinity. Strong, hardworking, disciplined men who know their place in the social order, and they are proud children of this fatherland that they are ready to fight for. And the more muscular a body appears in photos of this period or logos of these gymnastic associations, and see if you can find the logo of the Gasio, for example. This image of the muscular body is in fact a representation of this muscular character that becomes the ideal of masculinity during this period. And the way this ideal gains prominence in society is through the various sporting events and competitions which become extremely popular at around this time, this period leading up to the First World War. This is, of course, the golden age of sport, with Pierre de Coubertin seeking to revive the Olympic Games and to bring the first modern Olympic Games to Athens. events. So there is already an association between sport and competition between nations, so, nationalism. But in Cyprus, these events also become an opportunity in the context of colonialism to openly express political sentiment, a desire for political union with Greece. So these contests, the athletic contests, take place usually on national commemoration days. They incorporate fiery speeches by nationalist orators, and there's Greek flags everywhere, and there is a ritual crowning the sort of the winners of the various competitions. And it is, I think, during this ritual where the athlete slowly is transformed into the national hero, and also his body becomes a sort of a metonymy for the community, a community that is strong and muscular and ready to fight. The reason I think this sort of idealized image of masculinity is even more important is because it becomes also a yardstick against which women must also be measured. And if the body of the athlete becomes venerated and constantly exhibited, then the body of the sex worker becomes feared, despised, and isolated, and controlled. And during this same period, sort of the period between the crisis of 1886 and the First World War, we have the emergence of a feminine ideal, or a female ideal that is also quite masculine. And the woman who coined the term, Polixeni Loizias, describes it as follows: women who are wise, pure, masculine or brave, the word is andrie, like Athena, women who are graceful, upright, irreproachable in stature and will and purity and patriotism. Only these women may inspire a return to the achievements of the classical era. And the ideal is that of feminine masculinity, γυναικεία andria, female bravery. And this idealized vision is not only promoted by the mainstream press. We also have, during this period, the emergence of a dedicated women's press. And in this, women intellectuals participate, and they use this sort of feminine ideal in their demands for social equality with men. And against this kind of γυναικεία andria, this idealized image of femininity, we can see the image of the sex worker. Tellingly, we have very few references to women who sell sex in literature or memoirs, or even official records. But where we do see sex workers, they tend to be represented as presenting a sort of garish or comical femininity, heavily painted, almost as if they're masquerading. They are driven by self-interest and show no sexual self-restraint. They have sex with men of different social strata without making any distinctions. And so what we can see is that there is a creation of this sort of image of the sex worker as a woman who doesn't know her place, as a threat to moral and social order, a sort of Circe-esque character who usually leads men to their financial ruin and all kinds of excesses. And there is another reason why the sex worker becomes perceived as a threat, and that's a venereal disease. And after the arrival of the British in Cyprus, there is seemingly a spike in cases of venereal disease in the population. So there is a growing concern that not only are these women a threat to moral health, they're also a threat to physical health. And so both Cypriot and British doctors are sort of taking for granted that this is where the disease starts, even though as we know, that's not the case. It's a series of assumptions. However, during this period, we have an increasing demand for the passing of new laws to allow the authorities to control sex workers and the selling of sex on the island. And in the 1890s and 1900s, the municipal authorities and the legislative council and the government officials are all devising legislation to deal with prostitution in Cyprus. Of course, we don't have much time left. So I mean, for reasons that we can discuss later, the legislation does not explicitly mention that its purpose is to control prostitution. Whatever is more explicit is usually vetoed by the government. However, the authorities continued to take measures to control the sale of sex and sex workers, and collectively these laws allow them to segregate these women from the population, from the general population, confine them firstly to brothels and specifically in sort of clearly defined areas within towns, and secondly, these laws enable the authorities to clearly identify women who sell sex and to force them to submit to the police and medical surveillance. I mean, I guess I'll have to wrap it up, but I think what I'm trying to put out there is that once we start looking at all of these projects that are developed during this early period of colonial rule, we start to understand how new social differences are created in Cypriot society. And these differences are based on new, what we would call discourses, new ideas about different characteristics like gender or class or religion or community, morality. And so they constantly single out, identify individuals or groups that do not quite belong or need to be changed somehow or need to be under surveillance or and so on. And we also have the creation during this period of specific institutions that also do this work. I mean, it would be, I'm really interested in hearing your reflections on this, but just to put out there that the reason I thought this was an important piece of research to do is that when we think of this early period of British rule in Cypriot historiography, we tend to find a lot of research that has to do with the development of national identity. Historians tend to treat this period as the period before the period that actually matters, when people start fighting because of their national identities. And there is a lot of great research that is happening on this topic, but I also find that it is quite problematic. And Michalis Michaelis is the person who, for me, sort of clarified this thought that we tend to see the different communities in Cyprus as monolithic entities, as groups that march together towards a certain something over time. But we sometimes forget to see how there is internal difference, and how all of the identities or the senses of self come together to create a very complex social reality. And so without, we cannot speak about one of these social identities without necessarily talking about the others. So I mean, there's a lot more there, but we're already at 40 minutes, so I'll leave it there, and looking forward to discussing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Loizo, for your talk. I must say I really enjoyed it because I'm very interested in gender myself. And exactly as you said, reading gender historians, you don't really see this period of time being studied in detail. Most historians tend to focus on, as you said, the more exciting period of Elga and that kind of masculinity. But of course, that had a root somewhere, as you said. It needed to be developed and slowly growing, from what I understand. So thanks again. That was quite enlightening. And now we move to Q&A. So for those of you who want to ask a question on Zoom, you can move your mouse and click on participants, and you will see at the bottom right corner the raise hand function. And those of you who are on Facebook, you can also type down any questions you have.
So thanks a lot, Loizos, from me as well. Before we move to the questions, I would like to say that we would really appreciate it if you can fill in the feedback form in order to help us improve, and to stay to the end in order to find out about our next webinar. This was a really insightful webinar, Loizo, thank you. And there are many more interesting to come. So thanks a lot. And let's go to Olga Medaksa. Olga, we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes, we can.
Perfect.
I think there is a small confusion. We have two Olgas here. I think it was Olga Medaksa who had her hand up. Olga, we cannot hear you. If you would like, you can type down your question, and we'll direct it to the speaker.
So Emily, maybe we cannot hear you, Olga Medaksa. If you can write your question, maybe. So Emily, can you ask your question by the time that we get Olga's?
Yeah, hi. So I think one of my questions, for now at least, was, Loizo, you said that the new like laws and regulations to kind of control sex work and selling sex made it obvious kind of to recognize who is a sex worker. And I was wondering if there was more specifications on that, like how would they recognize them and what was what made them recognize them?
So the laws were inspired by similar laws that existed in mostly European countries and their colonies. In Cyprus, the law that was passed and then vetoed by the government, the venereal diseases law, required women to register themselves and to declare themselves as sex workers, and then to submit to weekly examinations by a doctor for which they had to pay. And I mean, this was considered by the government as an illiberal measure, and so not at all in line with the image the empire wanted to promote. And there were huge fights happening all over the British Empire at this time against similar laws. So it didn't pass, but the municipalities continued to identify and register women who sold sex. The only evidence we have of this system now is a book full of photographs, mugshots of women in the Larnaca Municipal Archive.
Thank you, Loizo. And also, I have one more question. It's a short one as well. You said that the higher class or the elites starting the gymnastics to create this kind of links with the lower class. And I was wondering, what was the intention behind those links? Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
It's a really good question. The background to this is that there is a contest in society, and this is described in a lot of detail by Loizos Kapsalis, an amazing book on this period. As the sort of the middle strata slowly become more dominant in society, and they use their sort of nationalist sentiments in order to overtake the established order in Cypriot society. The working population, the lower strata, become really important because we start to have voting in place for the election of representatives in the legislative council. So maintaining good relations with the working population is really important. And in a certain respect, a lot of these voluntary associations, everything from sports to religious clubs to working people's associations, are all geared to maintaining links between sort of the higher, more established classes and the sort of the working strata, or the middle and the working. And this is the background against which all of these clubs are founded. So it's very rare to find a club that does not belong to a network of clubs that supports a specific faction in Cypriot society. So everything from, again, sports to religious clubs to, even the most insignificant voluntary association will belong to a sort of a network of other clubs.
Thank you, Loizos, for your answer, and thank you, Emily, for your question. We have a text
Maria,
by Olga.
Let me add
sorry.
to that. I mean, of course, what ends up happening here is that supposedly you have this horizontal comradeship that Maria Georgiou talked about in her seminar last week, the sort of the membership in a community that in which the sort of social class doesn't matter. But of course, what ends up happening is that either way you look at it, the working population is actually deprived of a voice during this period. Effectively, what I'm talking about today is the construction of a paternalist, patriarchal system in which certain groups are disempowered, really.
Okay, thank you again. Very good question, Emily, and thank you, Loizos, for clarifications. So Olga Metaxa is asking, I would like to say thank you firstly for a great talk, smiley face. I was wondering how you think the education of the time, both the content of the education, but also the availability of education affected people's views at the time.
I mean, I'd love to hear more about what you mean by views, their own views on all of these ideas that we are talking about. I mean, this is perhaps the most difficult thing to measure. As historians, we have absolutely no way of figuring out how any of these projects that I'm talking about actually affected people's either understandings of self or their perception of their membership in a community. Or, I mean, this is also a reason why they are so understudied, these projects, because ultimately we can't describe a project as successful or unsuccessful. We have no way of knowing what its impact was. And this problem is also compounded by the fact that the people who are the target of these programs don't tend to leave any evidence, written evidence behind. So unfortunately, there is really no way of knowing how their views are really change. I mean, what we can see is that certain projects are more popular than others. For some projects, there is less resistance. So we know that there was a lot of resistance for the Sunday observance law, which people actually hated. They wanted to, because it stipulated that the reason why people wouldn't work on Sunday is so that they would go to church. And people felt that being forced to go to church was unfair. And so there was sort of, the Christian coffee shop in your neighborhood might have been closed, but the Muslim run coffee shop was open. So, first of all, the Christian cafeji complained, and all the customers ended up going to, the other place for coffee. So some of these, are obviously attract a lot of backlash. Others, not so much. People are quite happy to go and watch some sports. Does that mean they support the nationalist orator, or,
Thank you, Loizos. Yeah, it's super interesting how the elites were always imposing an identity from up down. So I think the next one is Maria.
Thank you very much. So I have many questions, but I'll make two just for now. Firstly, I would like to say that I really enjoyed the presentation because this is the kind of history that theorizes. Usually when we raise the question of what happened in the past, the answer is this battle or that war or that beheading. But we very rarely say that one of the things that happened in the past was different processes, including the process of making identities. At least when I was in school, never I came across, I was never confronted with the kind of history that theorizes and shows processes. So it was, what you presented today was very interesting from that aspect, that it showed a bigger picture and the processes. My first question is, you said that gradually there was an active effort that the young Cypriots, the new Cypriots, turned to the West, which means that before people turned to the East. So I was very curious to hear some of the centers in the East, if you would like, if you could name a few, like where did Cypriots travel or worked, or I don't know if there was any press, for example, in any of these centers, and so on. And my second question is the following. You mentioned the church being part of the developments, being very aware of the developments. I don't know how active they were in this process of making identities. And if they were, it seems to me that there is a kind of oxymoron here, because we are talking about a modernity project, if that's correct, and then we have the church involved. So I wonder whether you could say a bit more on this, on the relationship.
Let me take things in kind of order. So yes, I think processes are really important, and this is something I learned through my reading of Loizos Kapsalis. He is his was the first book that I felt transcended this sort of disciplinary division that we have in Cyprus, where everything except the period of Ottoman rule belongs to the history department, and then this specific 400-year period belongs to a completely different department. And so you know, the books will never sort of straddle this this transition. And I think another important thing that a project like this does is to show that certain processes, they don't follow the periodicity of political events. You know, my selection of 1856 as a starting point today was quite arbitrary, because before Makarios I, we also have Archbishop Kyprianos, who in fact founds the first, or attempts to found the first schools in Cyprus. And then we have Panarados, who is the first in the 1830s, who is the first to start funding centralized education systems. So I mean, you know, you can see that this is a process that is seemingly endless. In terms of the centers where Cypriots work and study, my research has been based on the work of Omilitis. He has a great book on the Kypriaki Loiosini. It's a prosopographic kind of account of intellectuals in both the East and the West, and some of the places in the East are, of course, Beirut and Jerusalem and Alexandria and Cairo, and of course in the Ottoman Empire, all the Greek communities, sort of the mainland Turkey, part of the Ottoman Empire, all of the Greek communities, including the big schools in Istanbul, Constantinople. So what happens during this period, what I tried to convey with this young Cypriots idea is what Kypromilidis calls a centripetal force that brings these intellectuals who used to be dispersed around the Eastern Mediterranean, the Italy and the Balkans. It's a process in which they slowly come back to the island and become active here. In terms of the church is always very active in all social and cultural processes in Cyprus, of course. I personally, I mean, the way that they are involved differs, because I mean, during the Ottoman times, the church is in fact the official leadership of the Orthodox community of the island. So they act more or less as a government. They control sort of the legislative system. They prosecute people, and they found schools, and they maintain schools, and they are involved in the taxation systems, and so they have a big word in how the community operates. What happens during the period of British rule, and again, Michalis Michail is the person to really consult here, is that the British are trying to diminish the power of the church, and the church is constantly fighting back in different ways. And a lot of these social processes that I'm thinking about involve this struggle to integrate the church into the leadership of the Christian Greek Cypriot community.
Thank you, Loizo. Maria, I think had a second question, or shall we move on to the next question? No? Okay. So we're moving on to Okshan.
Yeah, Loizo, thank you very much. I know that your focus was on these self-proclaimed young reformers, but I mean, following Emily's question, I just wanted to ask. So you said that these sex workers or prostitutes, they had to register themselves. Do you exactly know since when, and like what do we know about the other end of this story? Like what do we know about these prostitutes? Like where are they? Do we know where are they coming from? Are they foreigners? Are they locals?
Yes,
like
I actually.
Aspects.
Yes.
Blacks or fashions, yeah.
Yes, I mean it's like I said, it's very difficult to find statistics or references. However, there are a few reports, and in fact, they are at some point integrated into the census. There is a specific category for prostitute. What we can see is that there is a a surge in the number of women, especially who are involved in the sale of sex after the British arrive on the island. If you think about that, the fact that overnight Cyprus became a garrison of 10,000 soldiers, you know, you begin to see how there is, and of course we know that British garrisons always had women who followed them for this purpose. So we know that there were professionals who might have resided in Malta or Gibraltar, and they are informed of the movements of the army and make their way to Cyprus. And from what the British officials tell us, the majority of these women come from the Arab countries in the immediate neighborhood. There are, of course, a number of Cypriots, mostly Turkish Cypriots, and there are also a number of Europeans. So the proportion is about 75% foreign, 25% native. And I think the reason for this is, and this is my new project right now, the reason for this is that women travel for this purpose. So Cypriot women then move to other countries to work in sort of sex work, and of course the biggest center for Cypriot sex workers is Egypt, especially after 1900, when it becomes easier to travel to Egypt. A lot of women decide because to enter the trade is also to sever some of the ties with previous employers or family and so on. So the easiest way is potentially to travel.
Thank you, Okcan, for your question, and thank you, Loizos, for answering. We now go to Desiree.
Thanks, Loizos, for the interesting talk so far. My question is concerning the masculinity part of the talk. That you mentioned that there was an emerging feminine masculinity, if I understood correctly. And while men were being venerated, the masculine gymnast idea was being venerated for men. A similar trend seemed to be happening with the women, where bravery and wisdom and I think fitness were sort of praised for women, and femininity was associated with the sex worker and looked down upon, as far as I understood. And I thought that was, well, for me, it was confusing.
Yes, it is quite confusing.
And I wonder if you have if you could delve into that a bit further and explain why that was, because
Sure.
If it was to do with modernizing or essentially westernizing, which I took the masculine gymnast idea to be linked to, as far as I'm aware, that wasn't necessarily praised in Europe, or was it? So how did it come about that femininity was viewed as negative and a more feminine masculinity was praised?
Yes, I mean, this is such an important question. You know, the mental gymnastics one has to do to understand what is underlying these ideas. I mean, the fundamental premise of sort of the intellectual, the women intellectuals of this period is that there is no biological or social difference really between men and women. However, each gender needs to stay in their respective sphere. So how do we reconcile the difference, no difference kind of between men and women that kind of justifies the calls for sort of equality? And by equality, we don't, during this period, we don't necessarily mean voting rights and so on. This is just to be seen as something better than, you know, the livestock or the property of the husband. And the idea here is to say, well, men and women have the same kind of capabilities, but each will manifest these in different ways. So this sort of female masculinity, the andria and so on, is manifested usually through a woman's either sort of maternity. So a symbol for women during this time is motherhood, of course, or philanthropy, or which is, you know, certain women who have finished with their maternal duties or do not want to go into sort of maternity. They can be philanthropists or they can be teachers, and but all of these duties, let's say, all of these roles need to be for the community, for the nation in this case. So if you're raising a child, it's to make that child either a better woman in the service of the nation or the community, or a better man in the service of the nation. If it's a teacher, you need to train new citizens, new members of this. You know, I don't know if that makes sense. I mean, you can think of this. I mean, the symbol that is most commonly used is Athena, Ergani or Pallas, who is actually, if you think about it, not a very feminine symbol. It's a very Doric kind of wise, armed woman. It's not Aphrodite, let's say, you know, is a more feminine symbol. So one of the newspapers, I don't know if you can see, but this is one of the later newspapers, women's newspapers, used this sort of more feminine image of the intellectual woman, and the editor was heavily criticized for sort of her kind of her views on feminism and so on. So I think where you need to look is these more masculinized representations of womanhood. Another really popular symbol at this time is sort of the female heroine, like the heroines in literature, where all kinds of women will either fight a foreign invader, or they will save their loved one from death or something like this. And it's sort of this idea of course, they're not telling women to, you know, get out of their lane and, you know, arm themselves and run to the mountains. What they're saying is, what you do, you need to do like the men do for the army.
Thank you, Loizos and Desiree, for your question. Now we move to Ebrensel.
Hi, thank you. This is a follow-up question from Desiree's question. And what I'm going to say is maybe a guess, so it might be completely inaccurate, but I'm going to give it a go. So couldn't the idea be that the woman, in this sense, tried to adopt or what they were trying to do was what they actually did was to adopt the elites' ideas, the ideas of the elites. So it was the elite men who were shaping society at this time, and they were obviously promoting their own ideas. And these ideas were basically linked with masculinity as well. And it was the ideas that also applied to them, to the elite men. So,
Yes.
and when we consider women in this instance, they were the part of the society who were exploited and who were not gaining representation. So following from these, can it not be that they had to adopt those values of the elite men to be able to gain representation? And that was the only way to be able to gain, in a way, representation. Could this be maybe a, yeah.
I mean, this was the plan for sure. You know, if you can prove that you are equal in intellect and equal in wisdom and equal in bravery, then the next step is to ask for the right to be seen as more than, you know, a bride.
Yeah, but sorry, just to add something a bit more. But to be able to do those, they had to adopt the men's way of doing it, right? That was the idea, because they couldn't do it on the way that felt natural to them, for instance, maybe. But they had to do what the ideal, like not ideal, the elite men were, how they were acting and how they were in a way shaping society in all that senses. So yeah, that's all. Thank you.
I guess you're right. Ultimately, you can't beat them at their own game, really, can you?
Thank you, Emmerton, for your question, and Loizos for your reply. We're moving to Maria Santo.
Hello, thank you so much. It's extremely interesting. I also wanted to ask something on the female masculinity. Does the term masculinity come from the word andria, which is also associated to bravery, but bravery that only men, I mean, if you are to be brave, you have to be a man. I was wondering, the first one was this, and the second one, I was wondering whether this kind of masculinity or not being too feminine, too provocative also had to do with, maybe I missed it somewhere, if you had mentioned it, sorry, with conservative orthodox values. A good orthodox woman should be, you know, hen, the Christian women, Young People's Association or whatever, whether it also had to do with this, and whether it had to do, because you talked also about Athena, the goddess. She was a goddess of wisdom, even though Cyprus is the island of Aphrodite. She's more promiscuous for the liking of conservative Cypriots, I guess. So whether it was a kind of trying to bring the two together, the idea of Christianity, conservatism, and also, I don't know, ancient Greek culture, what we call Ελληνοχριστιανικό, Greek Orthodox, which doesn't actually go together, but whether it was a way of bringing it together. I don't know if my question is confusing, but I was wondering whether it had to do with that. Thank you.
Yes, you are exactly right about the Ελληνοχριστιανικά, Greek and Christian, at this intersection between the nation and sort of religion. Of course, this period is predates the Ochen, so I don't, you know, what is considered, I guess, the more socially conservative in the sort of 40s and 50s, you know, the comes after whatever is in, you know, in this period. However, yes, on the one hand, they are quite conservative in the sense that this is also a, so the effort to regulate prostitution in Cyprus is also a response to growing female sexuality, the growing visibility of female sexuality in the street. So when the British arrive, there is more opportunity, more freedom of to go outside, to mix with men in public. Because of the British Army, we have more bars and coffee shops in which women now work. There's also a lot more women who come to the town to work, either as maids in someone's house, or to sell their goods, or to sell services in the market. And of course, we have all of the women who come in order to sell sex. So effectively, what we have is the growing visibility of female femininity and female sexuality in public space. So in this respect, this seems more conservative. However, it's so confusing, like I was telling Desiree before, because this is also cutting edge women's kind of thinking in Cyprus. These women are very active in society, and they are promoting, you know, women's work outside the house, and they're trying to find ways to explain why women deserve more than they have. So it's at the same time very progressive and very conservative, and so it's very difficult to pin it down, to call it one thing.
Thank you, Maria Christou, for asking, and Loizos for your detailed answers. Angelos Sopoklou has a question.
Hello.
Hi, Angelos.
Thank you very much for your presentation. That was really interesting. As the discussion is around femininity, masculinity, and sexuality, how would you say that the way people dressed changed in this period? Was it less conservative? Did it become more conservative in a way, and people were more free to express their body or their sexuality through the way they dressed, and particularly women, perhaps?
Angela, I wouldn't. I'm not a historian of dress. There are the books out there that describe the evolution of dress for men and women. I mean, the biggest change is that we are gradually moving towards a European style way of dressing. I think that expresses also the change that is happening in mentalities and so on. What we do know is that in many ways this reaction to female sexuality in public has to do with the consumption of fashion. So a part of being this Doric kind of Athena Pallas kind of figure is to denounce fashion. So the Paris kind of experience, not for Greek women. Greek women, will go for something more plain, hopefully something produced in Cyprus by Cypriot women who are weavers and spinners. So it is as part of this whole system of kind of values, the rejection of fashion plays a big role. However, we also know that a lot of the women in the middle and higher strata will happily attend balls, hosted by the British authorities, even though they might disagree with the politics, they cannot not be seen in these events. And the newspapers throughout this period will describe these very luxurious events, and you will get a breakdown of the menu, and you will have the list of guests, and sometimes how events unfolded. So again, it's very difficult to answer this, to pin it down to one specific thing.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. So we are running out of time, so we are going to have a few more. One last question from Maria C, and then we can continue off the record. Mariamu?
Hi, everyone. So basically, coming back to what you guys have been saying about female masculinity addressing and all these ideals and virtues that I think they were promoted at the time, they're quite Hellenistic from what I understand. So, but we are essentially under still, we're not a colony yet. Well, Cyprus is not a colony, British colony yet at the early 20th century. But how were the British responding to these virtues? Why were they promoting something that eventually will, people will aspire to for unification with Greece? Wouldn't that be counterproductive for the British?
I mean, fundamentally during this period, the British are not at all trying to stifle or sort of stop expressions of nationalism, as long as they don't go over the top and are directly kind of. This is quite a liberal period for colonial rule in Cyprus. Things start to become a little more regulated, constrained after sort of the First World War, and especially after the riots in 1931. And that's when the British really cracked down on this feeling of the Cypriots belonging to the Hellenic nation and so on. During this period, I think the British are not so worried that things might get out of hand.
So thank you, Loizo. Maria, you last question quickly, please.
Thank you. I want to go back to the question that I raised in relation to the involvement of the church. I want to push a bit more. So I'm thinking, for example, the example of France, where I guess the question we need to make here is, there is a spread belief that Cyprus has been from kind of dark years, which was the Ottoman period, to a period of modernization, which was the British years. You showed that this is not the case, if I understand the argument correctly. I don't know to what degree we could say that in Cyprus, we didn't have per se enlightenment, but we did have some process of I don't know how you would call it. I would be very curious to listen how you would call this, what happened in Cyprus, because obviously it wasn't the dark years as we imagined them. There was something going on. And this process, no matter how you call it, to what degree is affected and then have implications raised by the fact that the church was involved? Because to go to the beginning of my reflection, in France, for example, we know that this process was very much about secularization, so breaking away from the church. I don't know if this makes any sense.
Yes, it makes sense to me. Again, it's one of those things where it's very difficult to, the mental gymnastics here is, I think sort of the historians like Kypromilidis, again, I think he is one of the people who are really looking into this process of enlightenment in sort of the Hellenic world, the Balkans, Greece, the Ottoman Empire, Cyprus. I think the point they're trying to make is that it's not as if there is no a process of going through the Enlightenment. Greek-speaking scholars participate in this process. They write a lot and they teach in universities in the West and the East. They come back to their homelands and they become the founders of schools and libraries and so on. And the church is actively involved in this process. A lot of the intellectuals who participate in this movement of the sort of Orthodox Enlightenment are clerics. However, we might have to see it as, the changes to the politics and changes to the intellectual kind of the sort of the morals, the character, the values of people. And this is more or less what I'm trying to say in the early part of the presentation, is that what happens during this last period of Ottoman rule is that from within the religious and the lay establishment of the period, we have a process where there is an understanding that there needs to be a change happening in Cypriot society. If Cyprus is to be like its neighbors, if it's to be like Greece, if it's to be like the West, there needs to be a change. That doesn't mean that they also want to overthrow the structures, sort of to overthrow the Ottoman administration, the Ottoman government, and they definitely don't want to overthrow the church. So perhaps we need to see these processes as different and to accept that the church can at the same time be a very progressive organization that promotes learning and promotes science and progress, but draws certain limits to the process of enlightenment. So, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, and so I'm not an intellectual historian, so I can't be more specific than this. But there is a big literature out there concerning the Enlightenment in the East.
Thank
I
you.
hope this answers the question.
It does. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam, for your question, and thank you, Loiza, for your reply. We have another last question request by Akshan. Akshan, go ahead.
Yes, I'm sorry about that. So I just wonder, like, if and whether an image of let's say, Muslim Cypriot or Turkish Cypriot appeared in these social projects. Because what was going on, I mean, this social cultural development within the Christian community, the Greek Cypriot community, was closely followed in the Ottoman press or in the Turkish press in 1920s, 30s. And it was taken as a model to be emulated. I mean, I wonder if an image of Turkish Cypriot appeared there as a, as a backwards, labeled, yeah.
There is no mention of Turkish Cypriots as a specific thing that we have to be different from. So in all my reading, there is no differentiation from the Muslim population of the island as something that we should not be. In fact, what we do see during this period is that, of course, in order for things to function in Cypriot society, in the municipal authorities and at the level of the Legislative Council, there needs to be some level of cooperation in order for these new projects to take off. And so it looks like most of the time the Greek Cypriots are able to find this support from the more sort of progressive Turkish Cypriots. There are lines again that can't be crossed when, especially because religion is sometimes such an issue. For example, where do we relocate a brothel? Definitely not close to a mosque, or sometimes things are obviously they become an issue, but there is generally not a cooperation, but an alignment of interests on this social kind of. So I'm really curious about this reflection of these projects in the Turkish Cypriot press, and like I told you in private before, I mean, I think this is the kind of loop where I'm not very clear if Greek Cypriots are actually reading the press from Istanbul or from the Arab world, and then they become inspired, and then this is reported in the Turkish Cypriot press, and then a similar project. So this would be a very interesting way forward for me to figure it out.
Thanks once more, Loizo and Okchan, for your question, and thank you to everyone that participated today. Great discussion. I enjoyed it so much. So next time on Bahçes, we are going to have Sefer Soidar, and the title of the webinar will be Space and Society, VAX in Urban and Rural Ottoman Cyprus. So VAX in Greek is Vakufia, and in Turkish it is Vakiflar. And they are economic institutions that have played an essential role in Cypriot society by acting as the redistributors of wealth in trade relations since the Ottoman period. In this webinar, we will explore how new methods in history, such as the use of geographic information system, can help us gain a broader understanding of how the VAX interacted with and shaped social and spatial relations. Thank you so much from me.
Thank you, Lambromu. So guys, I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to stay updated, we're quite active on social media. We also have an awesome website, which I'll be posting the link to right here. Here you go check it out. So Once again, would like to remind you that we're working on a voluntary basis. So if you'd like to support us, please try and make a donation on our website at historiesofbahces.org. And also we welcome new team members because our team is still growing. And we welcome people from all backgrounds and all communities. So we've reached the end of this webinar. We're now going to stop the live stream and the recording. But if you have any more questions, or you want to continue the discussion on Zoom, feel free to stay for more interesting conversations. Thank you, everyone.